Today, I wanted to talk to you about how to get the birth you want by being picky. And a lot of people, when they say, oh, you can't be too picky with your birth, or they'll say you need to lower your expectations, or your expectations are too high. Sometimes we're told that we're a birthzilla. I know that a few years ago when the Duchess of Sussex, whichever title Meghan Markle was going by, they said that she was a birthzilla and that she wanted a doula and a willow tree, and she was basically criticized. And we get the same thing. Oftentimes when we say that we want to birth at home, or we say that we would rather birth in complete darkness or have nobody touch us, we're told we're high maintenance or picky. And there's that negative connotation. But today I'm going to invite you to be picky and to be high maintenance, because this is going to help you to get the birth you want. So the way I found out about this is through learning about the law of attraction. And the way that the law of attraction works is that what you focus on gets stronger. So in the terms of your birth, oftentimes what we're trying to do is we're trying to avoid a negative outcome. We're trying to avoid pain. We're trying to avoid tearing. We're trying to avoid a C-section. We're trying to avoid an induction. But when we're focusing only on what we're avoiding, we're missing part of the picture. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to start thinking about how to create your birth vision, because creating your birth vision ultimately will help you in getting the birth you want. So the way that I applied this is that I started thinking about all the things that I did not want. And I'm going to invite you to do the same. So what you do is you take out a piece of paper or you write in your journal and you start thinking to yourself all of the things that you do not want in your birth. Be as picky as you want. If you don't want anybody to touch you during birth, then say that. If you want everybody to be completely quiet, you can say that too. If you want to have certain smells around you and you don't want other smells around you, such as you can't stand the smell of really strong perfume, you can say that too. You can say nobody's allowed to wear any strong perfume or cologne or anything else that's going to interfere with my space. If you prefer to have the lights dim, if you prefer to have nobody making any sounds in the room next to you, I myself noticed that I was incredibly picky when I was in triage. I didn't like having the sounds of other birthing people around me when I was trying to labor. I felt like I was in competition with them to try to drown out their noise. Anyway, what I was talking about is that with the law of attraction, when you're focusing only on what you don't want, you actually attract that. So when I was thinking to myself, I don't want to go to the hospital with my first birth, what ultimately happened is I ended up going to the hospital. And with my second, when I was thinking, I don't want my midwife to tell me that I have to transfer, what happened is that my midwife told me that if labor continued to go the way it was, that I was not going to be able to stay home. So when you start focusing, I want to avoid a C-section, what can happen is you get a C-section. If you're focusing, I want to avoid an induction, what happens is you'll automatically start attracting that. So you want to reframe that. So here's the exercise you want to do is you want to write down all of the things that you don't want. And if you have trouble with that because you're a first-time mom or you just don't have a lot of experience with birth, then what you want to do is you want to start immersing yourself in birth stories, because birth stories will help to show you all the different possibilities. And you can actually be picky at this point with the birth stories. I don't mean judging as in they were wrong, but in the sense of, that's okay for them, but I don't want that. That's not something that I would want. That's not something that would be right for me. Or, oh, they did that. I'd like to do that. So in my case, I started learning with my second birth, I wanted a call birth. I wanted to have that experience of trying to birth my baby in the amniotic sac. It didn't turn out. However, what I was doing was I was working towards that, and my membranes did stay intact until the very last moment when my baby was crowning. So that in itself avoided me having my waters released too early and then getting put on that clock and being told that I'd have to induce if things didn't pick up. And I also didn't have a bowling ball on my cervix. Instead, I had a nice squishy water balloon. So when you start thinking of the idea of what you want in your birth instead of what you don't want, and you start to see the options open up for you, then you've got the next part of your story. You go back and you check off all of the things that you don't want. So you say, I don't want to tear. Okay, so now you're going to think, I would like to birth my baby vaginally and come out of it completely intact. With my perineum intact and with my labia intact, I want to come out intact. So then you now want to find out how you can make that happen. But we're not going to focus too much on the how. Right now, we're just going to get that mindset of this is what I want instead. So you start out with, I don't want that. I don't like that idea. That doesn't feel good to me. And move towards the things, well, what would feel good to me? So when you do that, when you're focusing more on what you do want, and you have that list of, I want to have hands-off birth. I want to have autonomy in my birth. I want to have my baby like skin to skin, not taken away from me. Because if you say, I don't want my baby taken away from me, well, what do you want instead? If you say, I don't want to be pushed into a C-section just because I've had a C-section before, then what you're looking at is, I want a VBAC. If you're saying, I don't want to be induced, well, then you're looking at, I want to go into spontaneous labor. So then you're also looking at what spontaneous labor looks like, what VBAC looks like, what physiological birth looks like, what that golden hour of skin to skin looks like when you have your baby with you, what breastfeeding looks like. You start to think, how can this look? And don't just stick with the mainstream birth stories, because when you do that, you're just getting more of the same. We have a culture of fear in our society, and that's where the idea of lowering your expectations even comes from. It comes from the idea that birth is painful, birth is fearful, birth is dangerous, because you keep getting that narrative over and over and over again. And that's not what you want to do here. You want to really expose yourself to other options. So when you're thinking of what you don't want, what you also want to be asking yourself is, has anybody else done what I want to do? Has anybody else avoided this? Because if you're going into a mom group and you say, how do I avoid a C-section? It's probably not going to be a good idea, because you're going to get a whole bunch of people that say, oh, a C-section's not that bad, or you can't avoid a C-section, or there'll be a few that say, well, you have to have a natural birth, and that's just painful, and I tore, and I avoided a C-section, but I had all this horrible stuff happen to me. You get the horror stories. What you really want to do is you want to shift your mindset, find the positive stories, find the positive people, find the ones who have the education, the support that you need, and even the facilitators, such as midwives and doulas and obstetricians even, because there are a few out there. Dr. Stu is one of them, and he is an excellent source of information. Okay, so you want to immerse yourself in those positive birth stories. And I have a few here. If you go and check out this book, Birth Without Fear, it's a judgment-free guide to taking charge of your pregnancy and birth. And there's some positivity in there. Ina May's Guide to Childbirth, which is a little worn out because it was in a house fire. But this one also starts out with positive birth stories in it. So if you look at the beginning of the book, it has the chapters on actual positive birth. Then Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage is another really good book. It starts out with Eve's story in the second part of the book, in which she talks about physiological birth and goes into a great detail with the story of the composite character Eve, which is basically a woman birthing as a physiological process without the medicalization. And finally, if you're looking for something that will also give you a more positive outlook, Give Birth Like a Feminist will help you to think more like a consumer. I myself am also working on my own book that is going to be a lot like my 5 Pillars of Empowerment, with the case stories of what I've seen with my clients. But those books are a good start for just finding that positive birth environment. And then on top of that, you want to be on YouTube, you want to be listening to podcasts, you want to be looking at birth blogs, and you want to be immersed in that positive birth culture. I also share a lot of very positive birth stories. I have one myself. A lot of my clients have had positive birth stories. Even if it's resulted in an emergency or there was trauma around it, usually that comes from the environment or the support that they did not have around them, and not from their own birthing bodies. So what you can do is you can start to look at those stories and ask yourself, does this sound like the kind of birth that I want to have? And if the answer is no, well, then that's a no. That's not the kind of birth you want to have, so you're not going to follow that blueprint. But if there is something where you are noticing, hey, I really would like to have this kind of birth, then that gives you the framework to work with so that you can go in and get the right education. And then you can find the right environment that's going to support that idea. You're going to be able to find the right facilitators who are going to be able to help you with that, such as a doula, a midwife, an obstetrician, even the nurses around you. And then you also can build that right support, and you can get your team, your family, your friends, and your birth partner on board for that so that they know what you actually want. So now that you know a little bit more about how to get what you want, in terms of creating that birth vision, how do you really go about it? Well, once you have that idea of what you want, I want you to write it down, because this is step 1 that I tell all of my clients to do when creating a birth plan. If they're stuck and they don't know what they want, and some people don't, what we do is we look at all the things they want to avoid first. All of the things that are fearful, if you have that fear, then you can find the other side of it. There's a contrast there. And your mind can only think of something in a positive or negative term. It cannot do both at the same time. So what happens is when you're focusing only on the negative, all you're doing is being stuck in that fear. But when you start to ask yourself, okay, well, what do I want? Now your brain has shifted focus. Now you're thinking in the positive side, and the possibilities start opening up for you. And so then you can start exploring your options. You say, I don't want to have a hospital birth. Well, what does that look like? It looks like an out of hospital birth. Now there's so many options around that. So when you're creating your birth plan and you now have that positive vision of what you are committed to, then you can take those steps that I've talked about before, which is finding the right care provider, finding the right doula, getting the right support, getting the right education, choosing your childbirth class. All of that comes down to figuring out exactly what you want. So this is step 1. If you do not know what you want, if you don't know your options, you don't have any. And if you don't have any options, when you go with the flow, you're going with somebody else's flow. And most often that's a conveyor belt of interventions through the medical system that ends up with you with a C-section or an instrumental vaginal birth or tearing or trauma or any of the other negative things that have happened within the maternity care system when we give our power away. So by doing this, by figuring out exactly how you want your birth to go and what you would like in your birth and what you don't want, and when you focus on that instead, when you are coming to your decisions for choosing a childbirth class or choosing a care provider or choosing a doula or getting your birth partner on board or choosing where you're even going to birth, you are able to get the right support and the right education and the right facilitator because you know exactly what you want. The other side of that is that anything that doesn't work for you, if you come to your first appointment and your care provider says, we do our own epidurals here, and you've already committed that you are planning a natural birth, you know right away that that person may not be a good fit for you. And the more you ask the questions and find out, what they are actually committed to and what birth looks like with them, the more you can start to say, this isn't going to work for me. I need to find something different. Or I need to come to this in a way that I can advocate for myself so that my care provider, if they are the only one available, knows that this is going to be a different kind of birth, that they are going to learn something, and that they are going to understand that I am in charge. And I've been teaching my clients this exact method so that they can come to their appointments and be in charge instead of having their doctor say, okay, so you're 28 weeks and we're going to do this. And at this appointment, we're going to be doing this. And you have this test coming up and you have this thing. And then we're going to do a vaginal exam to check to see your progress. And then if you haven't had your baby by 40 weeks, we'll put you in for an induction or a repeat C-section. And that's just the way birth works with me. No, you don't want to be on that conveyor belt. So once you know that that's not what you're committed to, instead of arguing, you can say, this is not going to work for me. This is what I want instead. And you can come at it from that perspective and say, this is what I'm committed to. If something deviates at any time, then I'll have that discussion. But right now, this is what we're going to do. And it's going to be incredibly uncomfortable for them. And it may even be incredibly uncomfortable for you the first time you do it. As you continue to do it, however, you will have more practice. So the more you focus on what you do want in your life, the more practiced you will become at it. Eventually, it will become the point where you will be able to take that into your parenting and into your life. And that's really what you're doing when you're creating your birth vision, is that you're ultimately deciding, what do I want? And anything that doesn't fit that, you don't have to worry about it. You can just drop it. If you say, this story that this person is telling me right now, this horror story about their birth, is really making me feel uncomfortable and I'm not feeling safe, you are okay to put a boundary in place and just choose not to listen to that story. Or to take that story as they're telling it, if you are not able to get them to stop right away, if they really are just like those kind of people that you kind of feel bad for them and you don't really want to put that boundary of cutting them off completely, but you don't want to be pulled down into their story, what you can do is you can take the elements and be like, okay, so they had this happen. Okay, I don't want that to happen. So what can I do to avoid that? And use it as a teaching tool rather than the, oh no, that's what happened. So I better listen and I better just lower my expectations. You don't have to do that. Learn from other people's mistakes. Learn from other people's successes. Take what you are learning, apply it to what you want, and then you can move forward in your birth vision. Okay, so that's all I have today. I will see you soon.